Hello and welcome to the Tesme YouTube channel. I'm David and I've just come back from a very long trip to Japan. Between intensive tea ceremony practice and visits to potters and tea farms, it's been really busy. But most importantly, I've come back bearing tea. So today I'm going to talk about Shincha, the first tea harvest of the year. First I'm going to walk through what Shincha is, what it isn't, and a brief overview of the whole tea picking season. And then we'll go on to trying this tea that we brought back from Japan, and it'll be our first Shincha release of the year. First of all, what is Shincha? If you've been around the Japanese green tea world for some time, you've probably heard the term Shincha, and it can be a little confusing what exactly this term refers to. Very basically speaking, Shincha translates to new tea. This refers to tea that is released, that is made from the first picking of the year. This usually happens between late April and early May, or maybe even mid-May, depending where in Japan the tea is produced. The first teas harvested in Japan, usually around late April, come from the islands of Tanegashima and Yakushima off the southern coast of Kyushu. Then as the weather continues to warm in higher latitudes, areas like Kagoshima will harvest, and then northern Kyushu before it makes its way up to Shizuoka, and then Uji. Of course, exactly when the tea is harvested varies per farm, the weather that week, the altitude. Areas at lower altitudes tend to pick sooner because they are slightly warmer, whereas more mountainous regions pick a little later as the air is cooler. In any case, this is the first picking of the year, and as such is also known as ichibancha, first tea. This is in contrast to nibancha, or second picking, which would occur after the first picking, usually like a month later, and then there is sanbancha in summer, etc., etc. Now, strictly speaking, all sencha is ichibancha, because all sencha, narrowly defined sencha, is made from the first pickings of the year. With that in mind, what makes Shincha special? If all sencha is made from ichibancha, or first flush leaves, why is this sencha, that is also made from first flush leaves, any different? The primary difference is that Shincha is released straight away as soon as it's done processing. In contrast, most sencha gets processed as aracha, or raw tea, then put into cold storage and then taken out again later in the year when it needs to be sold, where it is then refined. Some producers will refine it first and then put it into cold storage. The point still stands that most sencha gets processed and put away until it is time to be sold. On the other hand, Shincha is released straight away, so it doesn't spend any time in storage and therefore is that little bit fresher. Another key difference is that most senchas in Japan are blended sencha, meaning that harvests from this year and last year are blended together to keep a consistent flavor profile. When these companies that produce blended teas also release a Shincha, that Shincha is only from this year's harvest and therefore is a more direct expression of the season. Historically, before the advent of modern cold storage and refrigeration technology, tea would degrade relatively quickly. So you'd have fresh tea in the months around harvest, April, May, June, but by the time it got to January, February, that tea was a little stale. Drinkable, but not quite as enjoyable. Now you might think, we have modern refrigeration, we can deep freeze tea. Why is Shincha still something that people rave about? And that might be due to one chemical compound, Z3-hexanal, also known as cis-3-hexanal, or hexanal for short, also known as lethaldehyde, this guy. This chemical is primarily responsible for that really grassy, green, fresh, vibrant note that everyone associates with Shincha, and it is incredibly volatile, and it will usually leave the leaves in a matter of months, even with cold storage. There is a related chemical called Z3 or cis-3-hexanol leaf alcohol, which also is a very potent, grassy, green, fresh, vibrant, lovely spring smell, but that's not quite as potent, and it's a little different. So when people refer to the Shincha aroma, or the sort of wonderful freshness of Shincha, it's primarily, or at least possibly, due to this one chemical, Z3-hexanal. If you've ever had the good fortune to go to a tea field in Japan and stick your face into fresh tea bushes, or walk through an aracha processing factory where the tea is being steamed and this wonderful fragrant aroma of spring is released into the air, that's probably hexanal. So for those who don't have the good fortune to do such things, you can capture a little bit of that burst of aroma in Shincha. Because this compound, as I mentioned, is incredibly volatile, Shincha should be consumed within a few months of its harvest. If you don't, it's fine, it'll just taste like regular sencha and not have the unique qualities of a Shincha. As I mentioned earlier, some regions in Japan, mainly the more southern regions, will release tea sooner than those further north, like Shizuoka and Uji. There's a little bit of a rush to the market as people want to get their Shincha on sale on shelves as soon as possible, because earlier harvest dates means that they are the first to be on the market, and therefore they are the first that are sold. This doesn't necessarily mean that they are fresher or better, it's just that they harvest earlier because the climate in these regions is warmer. An important side note is that the majority of tea released as Shincha is sencha. Sometimes it's kabusecha, but it's usually sencha, and it's usually not gyokuro or matcha, as these teas are traditionally aged until September, October, November, especially for matcha, in order to let the flavors round out, become more mellow. Part of this is actually releasing that leaf aldehyde, because this sort of extra grassy taste is not what's desired in gyokuro and matcha. We like it in sencha. So that brings us to today's tea, which is a sencha made from the Asanoka cultivar from Ujitawara, which is a region just outside of Uji, sort of in between Uji and Wasuka. And this is our first Shincha of the year. So let's take a look at these leaves. So one of the first things that you can tell from looking at these long, intact, needle-shaped tea leaves is that this is clearly an asamushi sencha. Asamushi, meaning light steamed, in contrast to like hukamushi, deep steamed, means that the tea is steamed for only less than 30 seconds, sometimes 20, sometimes 15, but usually 30 seconds or less. Steaming time is determined by a variety of factors, including the cultivar of the tea and how young the leaves are, etc. But it also has a stylistic impact, so asamushi sencha tend to preserve more of the natural flavors and aromas of the tea, which is why we went for an asamushi sencha for our Shincha, as we want to really capture that spring aroma and flavor. Another thing you might be able to tell by looking at these leaves is that this is an unshaded sencha, which is not particularly common in Uji and the surrounding region, as this area is famous for developing shading, which they use for gyokuro and matcha. But of course, we wanted to opt for an unshaded variety for our first Shincha of the year, as this is more transparent to the taste of spring. Shaded Shinchas are also delicious, but I wanted a more traditional tea to share with you. The soil around the region of Ujitawara and Wasuka is quite interesting, as it actually used to be the bed of Lake Biwa, or Biwako, millions of years ago. As the landscape of Japan changed, the lake sort of moved, and what used to be the soil at the base of the lake has now become the soil at the top and the sides of these hills and mountains in Ujitawara and Wasuka and some of the other regions in this area. This means the soil is very rich and full of clay. You can taste a little bit of this minerality in the tea, especially because it's short steamed and unshaded, so it's a little more transparent in the nutrients it gets from the soil, which is another reason I wanted to share this tea with you, because it's a very direct expression of this region and its unique terroir and climate and soil. Another point about this tea is that it was given a short hiire, or firing. This is the final step in drying the tea leaves, and some regions will give teas a strong firing, which gives them a slightly roasted, round flavor. Uji and Kyoto regions in general tend to do low hiire, and this preserves a lot more of the inherent qualities in the leaf. Before we brew this tea, I want to talk a little bit about how to brew Shincha. Now, you can brew Shincha the same way you would a regular sencha, and it would taste just fine. However, to capitalize on the unique properties of Shincha, I would recommend slightly tweaking your brewing parameters. For this tea, I'll be using 85 degrees Celsius water, which is a little hotter than what I would normally use, which would be around 75 to 80 degrees Celsius. This is because I want to bring out more of these aromatic compounds, such as hexanal. And to compensate for the higher brewing temperature, I'll shorten the brewing time from about a minute to around 45 seconds. This is also because Shincha is just that much more potent and full of aromatic compounds that shortening the brewing time makes sure that the tea doesn't get too punchy or even a little bitter or astringent. With that out of the way, let's get brewing. So now that my kettle is up to temperature, the first thing I'm going to do is preheat my teaware. You should always preheat your teaware so that the temperature that you've decided to brew at remains consistent. I also like to preheat my cups, that way the tea stays nice and warm. Another reason to preheat your cup is if you're going to use your cup as a measuring device, which I will shortly, this means that it is already hot and won't sap any temperature out of your hot water. Next, I need to weigh out my leaves, so I'm going to be using a 4 grams to 100 milliliter brewing ratio. This cup is 100 milliliters, therefore I'll need 4 grams. Preheated teaware also lets you better appreciate the dry aroma of the tea leaves. Yeah, that's Shincha. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to use my cup to measure out my water, and I'll set a timer for 45 seconds. Today I'm brewing in a hagiyaki hohin because I like using a hohin for brewing uji teas. This is what people in uji like to use, so I thought I'd do the same. We're at 45 seconds, so I'll begin to pour. As always, you want to pour nice and slowly. And you want to wait until the last drop so you can get as much of this first infusion out as you can. And to preserve some of the freshness of the tea and to appreciate the lovely Shincha aroma, I'll take the lid off and give it a little whack to dislodge the tea from the filter. Yeah, that's definitely Shincha. That is the aroma that you smell when you're in a tea factory. So you can see the leaves are a very vibrant green, but not quite the dark emerald green of a shaded tea. The liquor itself is a very bright and vibrant chartreusey sort of color, a little bit more green than the usual Asamushi sencha, which is usually predominantly yellow. There is a little bit of small leaf particles at the bottom of the cup, but that's part of the joy of using a hohin. If you want to learn more about the differences between a hohin and a kyusu, you can check out our video here. Without any further ado, let's give this a try. So the first thing that you'll notice, again, is the aroma. This is really bright and fresh and really vibrant, sort of zingy, for lack of a better word. The texture is not all that thick, it's very fluid. There's a tiny bit of the astringency that you associate with a light steam sencha, very pleasant sort of little tingliness, and that goes well with the sort of soily minerality that I mentioned earlier. Overall, this is a very classic uji sencha without any sort of additives of deep steaming or shading. As far as the taste goes, I mentioned the vibrancy and the minerality. It's not particularly heavy on the umami, which is a little different than what you might expect for an uji sencha, but because of the lack of shading and because of the potency of the sort of bright shincha aroma, it bounces more towards a light, zesty, fragrant sencha as opposed to the sort of bold, round, umami-rich types of sencha. There's a little bit of a sweetness in the aftertaste, but you can definitely sort of feel this tea. It's quite potent. For the second infusion, I'm going to use the same temperature of water and the same volume and just brew it for like 2 seconds, in and out. This time around, the sencha has a little more body, almost floral, not quite like the same floral as a koshin or a more floral cultivar. Definitely in the bright, zesty sort of region. For the third infusion, I'm going to use the same temperature of water again and brew for a little longer, maybe around 45 seconds, maybe closer to 30. I'm going to do this by feel because this is a tea that I'm still getting used to. The finish from the second infusion definitely lingers in the mouth. This tea has a lot of presence and a lot of potency. Because of this potency, I've decided to brew the third infusion a little shorter than I normally would, so this is around 30 seconds, I think that was. That subtle astringency that was present in the first infusion and was a little less present in the second infusion is more or less gone in this one, I think. There's still plenty of that brightness and spring aroma and taste, but it's mellowed out a little bit. This tea could probably go for another infusion, maybe even a fifth, especially if you keep these first 2 to 3 infusions on the shorter side. This is the first sencha we'll be releasing this year, so if you want to grab a bag of this very limited harvest, we'll be releasing it on our website on the 31st of May. Website's in the description down below. If you want regular updates about the teas and teawares that we release, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for future videos, make sure to leave those in the comments down below. As always, I'll leave a link to the teaware and of course the tea used in this video in the description. If you like this video, please give us a like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Asanoka. So that brings us to today's tea, made from the Asanoka cultivar kozbebe,